All right. Can folks hear me?
Loud and clear.
Wonderful. So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. This is the, apologies. This is the kickoff meeting for the renewable hydrogen study that we're doing at Odo. This is our first stakeholder workshop. So I am Rebecca Smith, and I am a senior policy analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy, and I am I am not a cat, but I am the lead author of the renewable hydrogen study that we'll be conducting at Odo. And sorry, I'm just trying to get my notes to appear. Here we go. I am going to be joined today with support from Jenny Callas as well as Linda Ross. So for our meeting today, we have a few key goals. First, we would like to provide everyone with some basic information about hydrogen and renewable hydrogen. We may not all be at the same level of understanding on hydrogen, so this is going to offer us an opportunity to level set and give us some common terms to use as we discuss renewable hydrogen. Second, we want to introduce you to the renewable hydrogen study that we're working on as required by SB 333, which passed the Oregon legislature this year. And finally, and definitely most importantly, we would very much like to get your feedback on the study. The study has a number of required elements, but we would like to hear from you about anything that you feel is missing from the study scope. Are there elements that we should, if we're able, to include in the study? If we can't include any or all of them, what are the elements that you'd suggest as most important for follow-up study, for example? So today we're going to start with some administrative housekeeping information, and then I'm going to walk you through the Odo renewable hydrogen study, including what's required of the study and the timeline for the study. And then I'm going to present a quick Hydrogen 101, which is going to give us some of that level setting. So for the meeting today, I am going to serve as your panelist, and my colleagues Jenny and Linda are going to provide support in monitoring the chat and addressing any technical issues you might have. I will present on the Odo renewable hydrogen study and then go right into the Hydrogen 101. So that right there is going to be a lot of me talking, and I apologize in advance. But once we make it through that, we are going to have about an hour for discussion in which you are all invited to participate. And then we have our community agreements. Some of our Odo staff participated in a diversity, equity, and inclusion conference for state employees recently, and they really appreciated the community agreements that they used. So we've carried those over here to help foster an inclusive discussion at this meeting today. So these include being present and being ready to learn, and certainly meaning this to be very much a two-way conversation. Being respectful to others, and certainly learning happens outside of our comfort zones, and that we agreed to listen to learn and not necessarily to respond. And finally, I want to thank you for being flexible and patient around any technology needs or changes. If you need something in this meeting, definitely ask for it. And we have Linda Ross on for technical issues or questions, and so you can chat with her directly if you do have any issues. So for the logistics, we are recording today's meeting, and we are going to make that available on the webpage for the renewable hydrogen study, the link to which Jenny is going to be dropping in the chat. We are in the middle of Ledge Days, and so I know there were a number of people that wanted to be here today who couldn't. So we'll try to get that online as soon as possible. Second, we have a great turnout today, which is fabulous, but it makes introductions a little trickier. So we're going to ask everyone to please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your organization, and a sentence about why you're interested in this study. You can certainly also use the chat to ask questions while I'm presenting on the study, or during the Hydrogen 101. If your question is about the material that I'm covering at that moment, for example, something that you don't understand or you need clarified, Jenny will let me know and I'll try to answer that question in the moment. Any other questions or comments, we're going to hold those until the discussion period. And these slides are all numbered. So if you have a question, you can certainly jot that down and you can include the slide number, and then we can go back to that slide later when you want to ask your question. As I said, we've set the final hour of the meeting for discussion. So when we get to that time, Jenny is going to remind us of any questions that were asked in the chat during the presentations that we didn't answer. And then we're also going to move on to the opportunity for live questions or comments. So during that time, to indicate that you'd like to speak, please use the raise hand function. I'm going to show you in a moment where it is. And Linda is going to do her best to get everyone in something approximating the order in which they raise their hand. Like I said, there are a lot of you, so please, we're certainly not trying to take anything out of turn. It just may be difficult, but we will certainly try to maintain that order. She's going to say your name aloud, and she'll unmute you so that you can speak. Oops. A little ahead of myself. Okay, welcome to WebEx. We here at Odo do not have Zoom, we have the WebEx. So if you're not familiar with it, I wanted to just point out a few helpful features. So at the bottom right here, you see the chat feature, and you can use this to send a message to everyone in the meeting, such as when asking a question. And you can also send private messages to the host or the presenter. So if you have any technical issues, for example, this is where you're going to want to message Linda Ross, who is our meeting host. I would not recommend messaging me directly as the presenter because my multitasking ability, that's just beyond what I'm able to do, and I won't see it. I apologize. So at the bottom of the window here, we see some reaction button, so we got a reaction button. And that's where you're going to find that raise hand button that you're going to want to use during the discussion period. There's also a second place where it is, that's up here on the top right. So in the participant list, you're going to find a little hand button next to your name. And so you can also click that to raise your hand. And just to remind you, that's the functionality we're going to use during the discussion. Okay, so and one final thing before we dive into the study, who is Odo? And we are the Oregon Department of Energy. We are the state's energy office. So our mission, put succinctly, is leading Oregon to a safe, equitable, clean, and sustainable future. And what we do, we have a position statement here with some pillars. And we've recently completed a strategic plan for 2021 through 2024, which details where some of these pillars came from. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but Jenny is going to share a link to that information in the chat if you're interested in reading more about that. All right, on to the good stuff. So the renewable hydrogen study. So SB 333, passed by the Oregon legislature this year, requires Odo to study the benefits of and barriers to production and consumption of renewable hydrogen in Oregon. And in addition, to the benefits, Odo is also going to look at the trade-offs associated with renewable hydrogen. And these are going to include things like safety, efficiency, cost, water usage, and others. I think that a number of those can, pretty broadly be considered to be potential barriers. So while the study is not going to feature, for example, a cost-benefit analysis of these trade-offs, we are going to enumerate them in the study so that legislators and stakeholders are better informed about whether and how renewable hydrogen could fit into Oregon's decarbonization plans. For the purpose of the study, the bill defines renewable hydrogen as hydrogen gas derived from energy sources that do not emit greenhouse gases. Now, this is not a statutory definition for renewable hydrogen in Oregon writ large. It is only a definition for the purposes of the study. And then just a little bit of nomenclature. As I talk about hydrogen today, You'll notice that on the slide, sometimes I use the notation of H2 for hydrogen and then RH2 for renewable hydrogen, and that's just for brevity. Oop, I'm just getting excited with that mouse. Okay. So there are a number of elements that are required in the study as per the bill, as I mentioned. So overall, the study is meant to provide a high-level analysis of how renewable hydrogen may support existing renewable energy and climate policies and goals in Oregon. The study must identify the volume of hydrogen currently used in Oregon, renewable or otherwise, and this will provide us with an idea of potential existing customers for renewable hydrogen, though certainly the idea of renewable hydrogen and as an economy is predicated on the idea that there would be deployed into many new sectors. But that inventory will help us understand where it's used now. And so ODO must also report on potential applications of renewable hydrogen in the state by 2030. And this year 2030 is helpful because many renewable hydrogen roadmaps assume that it will take time to stand up markets for some of the end uses of hydrogen, while others, like say heavy duty transportation, are assumed to be earlier applications. Another requirement is the assessment for the potential of coupling renewable electricity generation and renewable hydrogen production to increase resiliency or to provide flexible loads. Production of renewable hydrogen using electricity represents both an electric load that needs to be met with electricity, but it can also be a flexible load in that it's highly amenable to being controlled directly by an electric utility when they might need to reduce demand. And then renewable hydrogen can also be a resource for meeting electric load, either through combustion in a turbine or via fuel cells. And so that's what we'll be looking at as that study requirement. And then the study report must also provide a discussion of the forecasted costs of renewable hydrogen and how these costs might affect adoption in the state. Now, we're not going to be doing any forecasting ourselves. The bill does ask us to rely on existing data, but we will certainly take that data and then look at it through the context of Oregon. And finally, the study must identify the many barriers to adoption of renewable hydrogen in Oregon. So that's what's required for the study. Because there are a lot of technical aspects to consideration of renewable hydrogen, we have decided to put together a technical advisory committee, or TAC. And the goal of this TAC is to have a group of technical experts from the public and nonprofit sectors who can provide unbiased feedback on data sources to the extent possible, study assumptions, and other aspects of the study. In putting together the TAC, we very much sought out those who could serve as experts without necessarily serving as advocates of a specific point of view, as I said, as much as possible. So thus, the TAC is comprised of academic institutions, a national lab, the Power Council, our sister agency ODOT, who is working on a study related to hydrogen in the transportation sector. And then we also have NEA, the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. We also have some other folks that we've invited to the TAC that we're still working with. That includes Stanford University, another national lab, and US DOE. And then you'll see here we have a couple of folks listed as experts on call. And those were some folks that were unable to participate in the TAC due to time constraints, but have offered to serve as experts on call. And so this includes the National Renewable Energy Lab and JC Dream, which is a Washington organization focused on reducing the use of rare earth metals, in energy applications, including hydrogen. So the timeline for this study is that it's due to the legislature on September 15th, 2022. So we have started work on the study this fall, but the timeline shows the time remaining between now and September. So the research and analysis portion of this study is going to be completed between now and hopefully mid-Q1 of next year, January or February, though that depends on how busy the legislative session keeps us. And then after that, we're going to begin drafting the study report. In terms of communicating with you about the study, we have envisioned 3 stakeholder workshops. So today is the first one, and then we expect to have one in the first quarter of 2022 that details the initial findings of the study and gives you an opportunity to provide us some feedback. And then another one in Q2 that details those final findings. And so the goal is to keep you informed on the results of the study, and then, as I said, to provide you an opportunity to give feedback on those results. For example, did we miss an important piece of data, or forget to include a relevant sector? Or are the assumptions that we made in our analyses reasonable? We will certainly also be asking these questions of our technical experts on the TAC. Once the study is complete and the report is submitted to the legislature, we'll certainly follow up with presentations on our findings as well. So that's the study in a nutshell. And I know you have questions, or at least I hope you have questions and comments. But first, as I said, we're going to go right into the Hydrogen 101. And so that may answer some of the questions that you have about hydrogen and renewable hydrogen in general, and perhaps about the study, but also hopefully gives us a little bit of common ground. So on to the 101. Let's go over a few things about hydrogen. Like, what is it? I'm so glad you asked. No, really. So hydrogen is easily the most abundant element in the universe. It's in the sun. It's in stars. Jupiter is mostly hydrogen. Here on Earth, most of our hydrogen is found in water. There is a tiny little bit in our atmosphere, but it usually just escapes the atmosphere. Hydrogen is also the lightest element, and it has the lowest density of all gases. And compared to conventional fuels, hydrogen has a low volumetric energy density in both gas and liquid form. Now, you may have heard people refer to hydrogen as an energy carrier as opposed to an energy source, and it's true. Energy sources are the original source of energy. So think solar radiation in the form of sunlight, or wind, or hydrocarbons. And some energy sources are also the energy carriers, like fossil fuels, in that they don't really need to be, their energy can be transported and used by energy consumers in the same or almost same form in which it was found. But many energy sources have to first be converted to what we call an energy carrier before we can actually use them. So, for example, solar radiation has to hit that PV panel. And so hydrogen, thus, is a carrier of the energy found in another energy resource. So, for example, if you do steam reformation of natural gas, or if you use a resource to generate electricity, which is also an energy carrier, and then use that to produce hydrogen as an energy carrier. FYI, I use this information at cocktail parties all the time. So that gets us to those pathways for converting energy sources to hydrogen. And this chart is meant to confuse you. I'm actually not. It's actually really simple in that it shows some of the pathways for production of hydrogen, but not all of them. And so we have pathways here for converting fossil fuels to hydrogen, and then we have in red conversion pathways for nuclear energy. And then what we're really interested in are those pathways that are green. And so these are some of the pathways for producing hydrogen from renewable resources. And so here are some diagrams that are hopefully easier to follow. And so these show some of the main pathways for producing hydrogen from renewable sources of energy. Now down here we have renewable energy, which is going to include renewable electricity from wind and solar. And one way that we use that to produce hydrogen is electrolysis. And that may be the pathway that most of you are familiar with. And that's where you essentially run electricity through water to crack it into its components of hydrogen and oxygen. But it is by no means the only pathway. So, for example, we have a few different pathways for biomass, and this can include dry feedstocks like agricultural residues. It can also include wet feedstocks like things from, and biofuels like things from anaerobic digestion at dairies or from wastewater treatment plants. We also, I mentioned earlier, steam reformation of, like, for example, natural gas, which is how most of the hydrogen produced, used today is produced. And we can also do that reformation process on biomass and biofuels. So these are some of the, these are some of the main renewable pathways for renewable hydrogen production that we're going to look at in the study. So one of the things that we should mention is how we define renewable energy or renewable hydrogen or green hydrogen. So we very helpfully have that definition for the study given to us in the bill. But we haven't had any, federal definitions or other definitions in state law until recently. And so the federal infrastructure bill that passed in August finally gave us a definition for renewable hydrogen in US law. And actually, it's more a definition for clean hydrogen. And it defines clean hydrogen as that produced with 2 kilograms or less of carbon dioxide equivalent produced at the site of production for each kilogram of hydrogen produced. And so this is a carbon intensity approach to defining hydrogen as clean or renewable. So, you may have heard of gray or blue or green hydrogen. The industry is really moving away from that spectrum of colors, which doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about the actual environmental impact of renewable hydrogen or of hydrogen from other non-renewable sources, and instead is moving towards a carbon intensity approach, which is actually how, for example, Oregon's Clean Fuels Program and California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard address clean fuels. Okay, sorry. And so hydrogen storage. Hydrogen can be a little bit tricky to store. It's usually, there's 2 main ways that it's stored. We've got physical storage here on the left, and then we've got chemical storage on the right. So physical storage, it's going to be stored either as a gas or a liquid. As a gas, it typically requires high pressure tanks, where storage of hydrogen as a liquid requires cryogenic temperature, which is because of the boiling point of hydrogen. On the chemical side, hydrogen can be stored on the surfaces of solids or even within solids. There's been a lot of work going on at national labs and academic institutions regarding chemical storage of hydrogen and how to make it more efficient. And then we have down here at the bottom right, there's a mention of ammonia, and you may have heard of ammonia being used as a promising hydrogen carrier. And that's due to its high hydrogen content, and there's already an established distribution network. Ammonia is, easier to move around, and the hydrogen can then later be released on demand from ammonia. And so that's also considered a storage medium for hydrogen. There's also geologic storage, such as in geological features such as salt caverns. So this is a graphic from some folks promoting an energy storage project in Utah called ACES, or Advanced Clean Energy Storage. And their goal for this project is to produce renewable hydrogen and then compress it and store it in existing salt caverns. and it is being billed as the largest energy storage project in the world. The only problem with this is that salt caverns aren't distributed everywhere. They are just in kind of narrow areas within the world and within the US. So, with respect to moving around hydrogen, um, there are kind of three main ways that it's currently distributed. So the first is within pipelines. And there are some pipelines in the US that are dedicated to hydrogen, but these are limited. So there's been a push to add hydrogen into natural gas pipelines. So there's been numerous demonstration projects already doing this in Europe. There are limiting factors to this, however. First, it's likely only possible to blend, maybe up to 20% hydrogen by volume into a natural gas pipeline before you start to see problems with how hydrogen might affect pipeline materials. How much hydrogen might leak out, or how end-use appliances and buildings might react. So this is partly due to just the chemical and physical structure of hydrogen. It can easily migrate into the crystal structure of most metals. And so therefore, steel pipes, for example, that are used in transmission pipeline infrastructure can suffer from what's called embrittlement and cracking after continuous exposure to hydrogen. So any sort of hydrogen transport pipeline or any metal exposed to it should be resistant to corrosion or cracking. Compressed hydrogen as a gas can be transported in high pressure tube trailers, and these can go on the back of a truck, on a rail car, on a ship, or on a barge. This is fairly expensive, and so it's often used for shorter distances. And then you can also liquefy hydrogen to those cryogenic temperatures and then distribute it in tankers, again, via trucks, rail cars, whatnot. This is also expensive, but it is more efficient for longer distances. So hydrogen has been in use for many, many years in a number of industries, but as we discuss greatly expanding how we might use hydrogen in our economy globally, or closer to home, there are some common concerns that we hear raised. And I'm not going to go into all of these today, but I am going to highlight the first two, safety and efficiency. Some of the other concerns are the costs around renewable hydrogen, the potential of using renewable hydrogen to prolong the use of fossil fuels, NOx emissions from combusting renewable hydrogen in a turbine, and then the water use associated with producing renewable hydrogen. So going into safe use of hydrogen. And this is a big question that a lot of people have. And certainly no fuel is 100% safe. And there are a number of ways in which hydrogen is shown to be safer than conventional fuels. And so one of these is that hydrogen is not toxic, unlike conventional fuels, most of which are very toxic or contain toxic substances like carcinogens. A hydrogen leak or spill is not going to, contaminate the environment or threaten the health of humans or wildlife. Hydrogen is also lighter than air and many times lighter than gasoline vapor. So what this means is that when released, it typically will rise and disperse rapidly. And that greatly reduces the risk of ignition at ground level where people and buildings are. Conversely, propane and gasoline vapor are heavier than air, so they like to stay down on the ground and can increase the risk of fires that could harm people or infrastructure. And then finally, hydrogen has a higher oxygen requirement for explosion than fossil fuels. Hydrogen can be explosive with oxygen concentrations that are between 18 and 59%, while for gasoline, it's as low as 1 to 3%. Sorry. This means that gasoline has a greater risk for explosion than hydrogen for any given environment with oxygen. That said, there are certainly a number of safety issues with hydrogen that must be addressed. For example, hydrogen can ignite more easily than gasoline or natural gas. And so for this reason, safe design of hydrogen systems requires adequate ventilation as well as specially designed leak detection sensors. And as mentioned earlier, hydrogen can degrade certain metals, including steel, through a process called embrittlement. So choosing materials used with hydrogen is of critical importance. Given that hydrogen has been produced and stored and transported for decades, there is existing expertise in producing compressed hydrogen fuel tanks, for example, that are made of carbon fiber composites, or for example, carbon fiber paired with metal alloys. So here's an example of kind of a typical high compression hydrogen storage tank. And it has this inner lining of polymer that serves as a barrier from hydrogen permeating it. And then there's an outer layer that's made for impact and damage resistance. And there are a number of codes and standards for hydrogen tank performance. So when testing to ensure compliance with standards, tanks are subjected to more than, I believe, twice the maximum pressure that they experience under normal conditions. Given that hydrogen is the smallest known molecule, though, it is certainly prone to leakage. And hydrogen is considered what's called an indirect greenhouse gas. And that's because it interacts with other direct greenhouse gases like methane and ozone and perturbs them in the atmosphere. So thus, again, the importance of those sensors to detect leaks, which are standard on hydrogen handling equipment and at hydrogen filling stations. But certainly, as we've seen recently with a lot of the natural gas and methane leak detection from drones and from satellites, leaks are a big deal, and we should be worried about those. But because of the growing interest in hydrogen for decarbonization, scientists at national labs and universities have been working on research and development of new options for hydrogen storage and transport that are lighter, that are cheaper, and that better protect against leakage. So that second concern about renewable hydrogen that I wanted to address is efficiency. So if you're using electricity to produce another fuel and then later turning that fuel back into electricity, it's obviously going to be less efficient than just using that electricity for your end use in the first place. As an example, here is a diagram from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, that shows the round-trip efficiency for battery energy storage, and that's at the top here, and it compares it with hydrogen energy storage. And even just looking at the pathways, you can see that the battery pathway is way more efficient. There are fewer steps. There's less energy loss. And in fact, the efficiency here is something like 95%. And then you look at the hydrogen energy storage pathway, and it's not great. The round trip efficiency comes out to about 35%. And so this has costs. And so you may be asking yourself, with efficiency losses like this, why would anyone ever be interested in renewable hydrogen? Well, there are a few reasons. So first off, if we want economy-wide decarbonization, then we need to figure out what to do with some of what are called hard to decarbonize sectors. There's been a recent mantra of electrify everything among renewable energy advocates, and we can electrify a lot of our economy, but there are just some end uses where electricity doesn't make sense. For example, there are a lot of industrial processes like steel, cement, metal processing where electrification doesn't work. These need, high heat, a really concentrated energy source. But a fuel like hydrogen could greatly reduce the greenhouse emissions associated in these sectors. Another reason for the interest in hydrogen is that as we add more and more variable renewable resources to our electric grid. And I'm talking about those that don't always produce electricity, like wind and solar. We're having increasing problems around resource adequacy, a need for resources to help balance at peak times of peak demand, and also a need for longer duration seasonal energy storage. And that's really one of the places where hydrogen shines. So if you remember that graphic I just showed you with NREL, which showed the difference between 95% efficiency for battery energy storage versus the 35% for renewable hydrogen, it's clear that batteries are a real winner, but they're really only good for about 4 hours. And so when you start getting to the need for longer duration storage, which I'll get into shortly, you're going to see that hydrogen can be a much more cost-effective option. And then finally, there's certain transportation contexts where electricity just doesn't work. And there are other reasons why there's interest in hydrogen, but these are just 4 of the big ones. So going to go over really quickly resource adequacy and peak demand. So there's been a lot of talk in the Northwest about resource adequacy lately. And I pulled these 2 images from Odo's 2020 Biennial Energy Report, which you should absolutely read cover to cover. And it has a policy brief on resource adequacy. And put simply, resource adequacy means, do we have enough resource capacity on the system to meet demand over a spread of years? And that's going to include peak demand. And then down below here, we have ye olde duck curve. And this shows an April day in California. And so the light blue portion represents all of the demand for electricity being met with solar. And the dark blue is the remaining demand for electricity, or net demand. And that has to be met with other resources. And so the so-called belly of the duck here is the middle of the day when there's so much solar that it's meeting almost all of the demand for electricity. And then we get to 5 p.m. and the sun starts going down. And people, at least in the before times, would get off work and would come home and would turn on lots of things that consume electricity. And then we have this ramp. And to meet that ramp, California has traditionally relied on what are called peaker plants, which are natural gas plants that can spin up quickly as soon as they're needed. Increasingly, batteries are also being used to address peak demand. And as I said, that's where lithium-ion batteries can really shine, providing those shorter bursts of energy for minutes or just a few hours. But it's expensive to build enough batteries to replace all of the flexible resources we had or phasing out that could meet that peak demand. And so hydrogen can play a role here in 2 ways. First, it could help replace some of those natural gas peaker plants, either combusted as a fuel or via fuel cells, which would allow, a resource to meet that ramp quickly. And then second, electrolyzers producing renewable hydrogen, as I mentioned earlier, are a flexible load that can easily be turned off or down. They're not critical functions, so that's load that could easily be shed during times of peak demand. And what I mean is that, for example, if you had electrolyzers on your system, as you start to hit that 5 p.m. peak, that's demand that you could shed at that moment. And so that ramp is easier to meet. But really, as I said, long duration energy storage is, when we talk about energy storage, this is really a competitive advantage for hydrogen. And lithium-ion batteries will be able to take a lot of that peak demand ramp and peaker plant replacement. But as I said, they're really only good for about 4 hours. And after that, they start to get fantastically expensive. So when it comes to the grid, where renewable hydrogen energy could really shine is in providing long duration or seasonal energy storage for days, for weeks, even months. And this becomes increasingly important with our grid populated with variable renewable energy, because there will be events when those resources don't perform for long periods of time. Say, when we have a really long cold snap in the winter with low wind, we wouldn't be getting as much solar, we wouldn't be getting as much solar radiation. So we wouldn't be getting as much from wind, either with the low wind, and we could be having really high demand for heating in our increasingly electrified buildings. And so here's a diagram that shows some of the available storage technologies and kind of where they fit on this axis. We've got storage capacity here and then release time. And so you can see, some of the batteries here, really make sense for some of those shorter periods. But when we start looking at longer duration, that's where we start to see compressed air, pumped hydro, and hydrogen as the most viable options. And those are the three that NREL identified as most viable for that long duration energy storage. And then finally, transportation. And this is a slide that I stole from Evan Ramsey at the Bonneville Environmental Foundation. And these delectable claws give an idea of the role that electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles can play, respectively, in light duty and heavy duty transportation contexts. For light duty, you see that the meatiest part of the claw here is given over to electric vehicles with lithium ion batteries, what we all really think of when we say EVs. And that's because these EVs are great for light duty. The weight of the batteries isn't a huge issue. And for many uses, these vehicles do not need to be driven hundreds of miles every day. And so the time to recharge the batteries isn't, a huge concern daily. And there may be a role for hydrogen vehicles in the light duty sector, and that's represented by the smaller part of the claw. And over on the heavy duty side, you see that the bigger part of the claw is given over to hydrogen. And this is because there are likely to be a number of use cases where the potential weight of lithium ion EV batteries could be a problem, as well as how much space those batteries could take up that could otherwise be used to carry more goods. And some of these use cases will require that vehicles travel many miles a day on schedules that don't really allow for long refueling times. So thus hydrogen would make more sense, and renewable hydrogen as a transportation fuel there. So hydrogen is also being considered for a lot of ground equipment at ports, and it's actually already in use for forklifts at many warehouses. And so there are also some new pilot hydrogen ferries and other marine vessels, though it's still unclear to what degree hydrogen might be deployed in the marine sector. So here's a schematic from the US DOE, and that shows a many number of end uses for hydrogen and renewable hydrogen. This is essentially a representation of the hydrogen economy. And there are niches where renewable hydrogen makes sense today. Like I said, long duration energy storage, hard to decarbonize sectors, some transportation. These are places where we're just really not spoiled for choice for other options. And that's where we're likely and frankly already seeing hydrogen and renewable hydrogen deployed. Now, whether or not we come to this kind of hydrogen economy-wide deployment in the graphic is a question, and that will depend on a number of factors, including what choices we make in our decarbonization journey. And in plotting our path to decarbonization, it is important to remember that we do have choices. We have options. There is no one true road to decarbonization. And every single one of those options is going to have trade-offs, be it land use or materials use or cost and so on. And so it's up to us to determine which trade-offs we're willing to make. And so this schematic represents one of our possible decarbonization futures. So, okay, last slide, wrapping up. You've been a wonderful audience. What's happening with renewable hydrogen today? And honestly, there's so much going on and it's all changing rapidly. And so I'm just going to give a generic update here. Globally, there are a number of countries that have announced renewable hydrogen strategies and targets. The EU also has announced targets for deployed megawatts of electrolyzer capacity. There are demonstration projects in Europe to inject renewable hydrogen into natural gas pipelines. There's also been some work pairing offshore wind with electrolyzers. Here in North America, British Columbia announced last year its renewable hydrogen strategy. Pardon me. And the US DOE recently launched its hydrogen shot program with a goal of getting down to $1 per 1 kilogram of hydrogen in 1 decade. Though, to be clear, that this program applies to all pathways for hydrogen, so renewable and otherwise. But this does mean that there is a lot of research happening around renewable hydrogen. And we also have the federal infrastructure bill that passed in August, and that provides billions for renewable hydrogen through a number of avenues. With respect to projects in the Pacific Northwest, pardon me, there's a project in Washington at the Douglas County Public Utility District, and then there are also some potential projects planned or announced as possible in Oregon. And that's nowhere near the universe of what's happening, but that's enough for today. So we made it. And now for the discussion portion of today's program. I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments about renewable hydrogen and the study that we're undertaking. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of required elements, but we'd really like to hear from you about anything that you might think is missing from that, anything you'd like to see us add. And I'm actually going to... All right, sorry, I'm just trying to navigate a number of windows. So I'm going to go back to slide 9 with our study requirements. Okay, so Jenny, do we have any questions in the chat that that I did not answer through the course of this presentation?
Yes, I think we have one that we can probably clarify. I think there was a little bit of discussion around it. And I would say to the rest of the folks, if you have questions or comments, start getting ready, start thinking about it. Feel free to put your hand up. And my colleague Linda Ross will start unmuting and calling on folks. Also, feel free to continue to use the chat. So Rebecca, we had a question and a little bit of back and forth, starting with Skip Sponsel. And I apologize, Skip, if I said your name wrong. Around slide 20, you noted that trucking hydrogen is more expensive than pipelines. And so the question is, how do costs of trucking hydrogen compare to the costs for trucking and propane? Is the cost per hour of the truck on the road about the same? And then Ken Dragoon responded saying that the trucking cost of hydrogen has a lower volumetric energy density, about 1/3 that of natural gas. So in short, it takes more trucks to deliver the same amount of energy. So what do you think about that, Rebecca?
I think, thank you, Ken Dragoon. That is definitely a huge part of the cost, as he mentioned, as Ken mentioned, because hydrogen does have that lower energy density. You're going to need more trucks to get the same amount of energy than you would another fuel. For costs beyond that, I have not looked into that yet, but the distribution costs of hydrogen are something that we will address in the study.
Great. And there have been some helpful comments in the chat. And just to let everyone know, we will be exporting the chat, so we'll have this recorded. Rebecca will have it as she continues with the study. And with that, Linda, any hands up yet? I haven't seen anything new come in the chat.
Yes, there's a Steve Ellis that's going to be, that we can unmute. Steve, you can speak now.
Hello?
Hello.
Yes, Steve.
Okay, sounds good. Hey, this is Steve Ellis. I'm with First Element True Zero brand that's building hydrogen stations in California. And first and foremost, thanks for putting this together, and a lot of good work here. There's a lot to digest. And certainly, you're taking on I'll call it the top of the funnel, where as you pull through it, you have opportunities to move some things along faster than others. So one of my comments was, when I hear the word study, and I heard it a lot, often that is too often a excuse for delay. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but rather you can study things to death while maybe in some areas, the work has already been done and you can simply look to your left or right, in other words, another state, and see what they're doing. And that's, I would just say, an opportunity for you. Second is on this point about the transportation. I did comment on that back to Ken and said, while it's true about the energy density and his contention, it takes more trucks to move it than another fuel. The vehicles, keep in mind, in the purpose of transportation are 2 to 3 times more efficient than a comparable internal combustion. And so this assumes use of either light duty or heavy duty with a fuel cell. Therefore, they travel a lot further per, let's just say, the gasoline gallon equivalent amount of fuel. So in other words, it takes a lot less fuel for a equivalent number of miles when used in a fuel cell vehicle. So in essence, it does not take, let's just say, 3 times more trucks of fuel to serve the same number of vehicles. Just wanted to comment on that.
Thank you so much. To your first point about, study versus action, that's certainly very well taken. I think that because this is such a new area, and this is just my guess, is that the legislature wanted to get a little bit better of a handle on it. But that said, obviously, things are going to keep moving forward, even if Oregon were to decide to keep doing studies, especially with, as I mentioned, the federal infrastructure bill. There's funding in there, for example, for hydrogen hubs, for renewable hydrogen at ports. And so, we're just going to see projects in advance, probably, of policy, as we then try to figure out what policy we need to meet the goals that we have.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'll just give an example. In the Northeast states, they've been studying for 10 years. About 6 to 8 years ago, I myself was back there talking with different coalition of states. And one of my points in testimony was that by time you figure it out, it's too late. And here we are today. They still don't have a network of stations capable of supporting vehicle transportation, while many people have done a lot of work to try to enable that. So that's just my constructive caution that there can be things you do quickly for action, while maybe some of the larger scale projects and things like that will continue to need study. So I think you got the right balance there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Rebecca, we've had a few more questions come in through the chat. So I'll start with Abraham Mooney asks, will biomass to hydrogen via SMR or other thermal conversion be considered in the study?
Great question. And so, that was, so when you said SMR, so small modular reactor, that means nuclear. I'm assuming, I'm assuming that's what you mean instead of steam methane reformation, or maybe I'm wrong. There's too many acronyms. So to assume
Abraham just clarified steam methane reformation.
Okay, good. Sorry, Abraham. So yes, so looking at those potential pathways for renewable production of hydrogen, we are going to look at those in the study, because using an electrolyzer is not the only pathway, and it may turn out to be the best pathway. It may turn out to be the most cost-effective pathway, most efficient. I don't know, but certainly we have a lot of biomass resources in Oregon, and so the study will look at pathways beyond just the electrolyzer.
Great. And then Chris Croker asks, given the definition of renewable hydrogen being hydrogen that does not emit greenhouse gases, will this include blue hydrogen then produced from partial oxidation processes where 99% of carbon is captured? This process arguably has emissions on par with green hydrogen produced from a variable grid mix.
That's a really great question, Chris. And this is something that certainly, as I read through the bill and the definition, I had some questions about. So going back to that definition, hydrogen gas derived from energy sources that do not emit greenhouse gases. So does that mean that blue hydrogen that was developed from a fossil fuel, but then had some sort of carbon capture associated with it, or some other way of mitigating those greenhouse gas emissions, would that qualify as renewable hydrogen under this definition? Also, would, hydrogen production powered by nuclear energy, would that also count? And so these are questions that we plan to raise in the study. And so certainly consider what some of those pathways look like, and raise some of the considerations that we need to make to determine whether or not we as a state want to have those pathways included in our definition of renewable or clean hydrogen or not. Certainly, as I mentioned, the industry is very much moving towards a carbon intensity approach. And so, there are pathways that involve fossil fuels that could have a relatively low carbon intensity. So, if that's the way that the industry ends up going, it's certainly valuable for Oregon to consider the ramifications of that on, in our state and in our decarbonization pathway.
So a couple of clarifying or related questions. Jason Modi asked, does greenhouse gas, when we say greenhouse gases, are we including oxides of nitrogen?
That is, another great question. So we've certainly got, the big six, and then we've also got some short-lived climate pollutants. I think that these are all questions that we should raise in this study, just about, these are things to think about when we choose to define what this resource is. How do we define whether it's renewable or not? How do we define what we include as a greenhouse gas or not? Because we do have options there.
And then Nico Bocamp, and I apologize, Nico, if I said your name incorrectly. You answered this a little bit, Rebecca, but can you talk about how carbon intensity scores will play a part in the study?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. Certainly we will be looking at what the carbon intensities have been assumed to be for certain pathways of hydrogen and renewable hydrogen production. If there are pathways we find that seem reasonable, in that they seem like they might be commercialized within by maybe that 2030 date that we have in the study. That date kind of applied to one part of the requirements, but I think can be kind of overall a good date to look at in terms of what's going to happen with renewable hydrogen in the near term, or what's likely. And so in terms of what data is available out there on the carbon intensities of different pathways, we will certainly include that. There may not be data on all of those, or there may be, questions about that data and assumptions about them. So certainly there's been a lot of assumptions about the emissions associated, with blue hydrogen. And so that's part of what we're also going to call on our third-party unbiased technical experts about, is in terms of helping us parse some of that data. Is this a reasonable carbon intensity figure? Does this make sense? Or were there assumptions in the development of this that we really need to be aware of?
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question from chat, and then I think we may have a hand or two up. Also from Ken, when looking at existing uses of hydrogen, will uses such as ammonia and fossil fuels consumption be included, since hydrogen is used in the manufacturing of those products? Although not in Oregon now.
I would certainly like to. I think that part of that question comes down to capacity and data availability. If we have time to really kind of expand how we define hydrogen for that inventory, then I think it would be really valuable to include that information. And then certainly the second question is how much data we're able to get on that and how quickly. So the answer is maybe.
That seems like a fair answer at this point in the study. I thought I saw a hand up, but I'm not sure now. Linda, anybody with hands up right now?
We did have a Jacine Moody. Would you like to engage?
Just a quick question on decarbonization. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
Justin.
Right. So back to the decarbonization, flexible resources. We have existing flexible resources that use gas right now. What about blending gas to decarbonize those flexible resources? Would that be addressed in the study? That's the first question. The second is on diesel. There's so much diesel in this world, and can we also look at how we can replace diesel with hydrogen for backup generation and other manufacturing plants that use backup generators?
Thank you. Those are great questions. And so first, in terms of the decarbonization, and certainly one of the study requirements is that we look at. Sorry, I'm just going back a slide. So it asks us to identification of potential applications of renewable hydrogen in Oregon by 2030. And so there are a lot of things that could fall under that. And so I think that blending that renewable hydrogen, into, a mix of, for example, of natural gas to go into a turbine where maybe there's 10, 15, 20% hydrogen, is something that we'll look at as a potential application, simply because that is within the universe of possibilities for kind of that time frame. And then second, your question about backup generators and whatnot. That's also a potential application that we'll look at. Certainly, there's been some interesting work done by some of the big tech companies who have huge data centers, for example, where backup power is critical. And they've been relying on these old diesel generators for decades. And so some of them, for example, Microsoft, are looking into the possibility of hydrogen as that backup fuel instead. So we'll certainly include that as one of those potential applications.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
I don't see anything new in the chat. There's some really great comments. And again, we'll be recording these and Rebecca will have them on hand as she continues the study.
And Jenny, if you could drop my contact information into the chat, that would be great. This is not your only opportunity for feedback. I mean, not only are we going to have those two other workshops that I mentioned, you will make my contact information available. And I encourage you to reach out with any questions or comments or concerns that you might have.
You got it. Just dropped your email in the chat. I also put a reminder link to where you can find more information about the study, find relevant links. Rebecca mentioned the Biennial Energy Report. There are links to the relevant report pieces from that page as well. Sign up for future notices, and we hope you stay engaged. I'm not seeing any. Oh, we just got a new question in. Will the study analyze the most commercially viable applications for renewable hydrogen, given the current regulatory environment? That question was from Evan Ramsey.
Evan, thank you. Will we look at, can you read that again, Jenny? Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. Will the study analyze the most commercially viable applications for renewable hydrogen, given the current regulatory environment?
I think that we should be able to do that. One of the things that the bill directed us to do was to rely on existing data to the extent possible and to provide a relatively high level analysis. And so they've asked us to look into a lot of things. And so, the depth that we can go into all of those is thus a little bit limited, but that is an important question. And certainly it goes to that study requirement, I believe, of identification of potential applications by 2030. And I read that to mean, one, not only the universe of options, but what's also really most likely. And part of that is going to be based on what enabling policies do we have, what are the costs where certain it becomes attractive to certain sectors, kind of what's bubbling up in terms of, for example, models available for heavy duty vehicles that are hydrogen fuel cell. So we will be able to touch on that, probably not to the depth that you and I would love to have it, but that's certainly going to be an important consideration of kind of where are those best bangs for buck, so to speak.
Thanks for the buck. I like that. A new question just came in from Skip Sponsel. Is there an imperative for this initiative to sync with and support initiatives within other state entities?
It's not made explicit in the bill for the study. Really, the bill focuses on Oregon, but I would suggest it's really difficult to think about hydrogen, in the vacuum of a single state, because the infrastructure would really make sense more on a regional basis. And certainly that seems to be where things are moving. A number of the the province, like for Canada, BC, and some of the country strategies really talk about a hydrogen hub approach. And so that's the idea, that there might be these regional hubs that could produce hydrogen on site and that could then meet demand for a large area. And then that federal infrastructure bill provides fundings for renewable hydrogen hubs, regional hubs. And so while to meet the requirements of this bill, we're really going to try to focus the study on the context of Oregon and what makes sense with our resources, with our electricity mix, with all of that, but also still keeping that view of what's happening regionally. And certainly because we have California to the south, and they are certainly the farthest ahead in terms of incorporating hydrogen and renewable hydrogen into their economy. And we also have Washington that's interested in it as well. And so I think we would be really remiss not to address that as well in the study.
Great. I don't see any new questions. There's some great comments. Again, thanks for weighing in on those, folks. Linda, anybody with a hand up wanting to say anything out loud?
No, don't see any.
Okay. Kind of hang out and give folks a few more minutes to think about it if they have any other questions or comments. Steve Johnson just asked, can you please show the slide with the time period for storage again, please?
Yes. Let me find that.
And Steve, feel free to raise your hand or add any clarifying questions to the chat if you had a question about that slide when Rebecca finds it.
So many slides. I believe this is the slide in question.
Oh, he said that's it.
Okay.
That looks like a rocket ship.
And did you have a question about this slide, Steve?
He asked if you can just discuss it again. So maybe go back over what it says.
Sure. So, so this is looking at essentially how long an energy storage medium can release energy. And so that's going to be this axis here. This is the release time. And it goes all the way from milliseconds up to a year. And then we have the storage capacity. So starting with a kilowatt hour all the way up to a terawatt hour. And so what it's showing here is, in this bottom quadrant here, we see energy storage opportunities that are both short duration, so they really only release for very short periods of time, and they don't really hold a ton of energy. That's not to say that there might not be really great end uses for them, but it's just short release time, small capacity. And so we start to get up here, and then we get batteries here. And so they've got a flow battery in here, also some of the lithium ion. And so this is where we start to see some of that battery storage where we're starting to get bigger in terms of the amount of capacity that it can store, and also longer in terms of how long it can release. And I know that there is a lot of research going on flow batteries as opposed to lithium ion, because they do have the potential to have a longer release time, though still it's going to be kind of, at least my understanding of flow battery technology right now is that it's still kind of be in this area. So these are, again, they're a little bit bigger, but still good for kind of fast bursts of, maybe a few hours, possibly even a whole day. And then we get into this quadrant, and this is really where we have high storage capacity. We can store a lot of energy, and we can also release it over a long time frame. And so I'm not gonna lie, I do not know a lot about compressed air technology, other than NREL and others think it's kind of one of the 3 good options for long duration energy storage. We've also got pumped hydro in there, and frankly, that's where most, if probably not all, of our existing long duration energy storage is deployed as right now in the country. And so you can really, depending on the size of the installation, get a lot of long duration storage from that. And then also they have hydrogen in here. And sometimes you'll see a graphic like this that includes with hydrogen kind of other what are called electrolytic fuels. And so those might be electrolytic methane or ammonia.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm hoping that Steve will let us know if he has any follow-up questions. We got a new question from Nico. Although the end goal is ZEVs, how do gas to liquid fuel technologies play a role for drop-in fuels for all grandfathered in vehicles equipment that use gasoline and diesel? So how do gas to liquid fuel technologies play a role?
That's a great question. And I think that from what I'm understanding, and again, I'm, still relatively new to tracking what's going on with the marine and aviation sectors in terms of what might be the decarbonized fuel that works there. But certainly there's a lot of discussion around the role that biofuels, especially very low carbon intensity biofuels, and then electrolytic fuels, these synthetic fuels that we use electricity to produce, including hydrogen, but not only hydrogen, and the role that they might play. And so my understanding is that for some of those biofuels, and maybe some of the electrolytic fuels, but not hydrogen, are likely what we're going to see, for example, in aviation. Certainly, you may have seen headlines about some small 4-seater planes that are electric, and those are cool, but we're really probably not going to see an electric 747. What we're likely going to see is, some kind of biofuel created from a biogas or from some other pathway or from an electro pathway to fuel that. And that might also happen with some of the larger marine vessels.
An electric 747 would be pretty cool, though.
It would be so heavy.
It would be so heavy. Yeah. Passenger free. I don't see any new questions coming in, and I don't think I see any hands up either.
Nope, no hands.
No hands. Oh, we got a new question from Matt Kirsch. Do you think the study could analyze cost reduction leaning curves due to manufacturing scale versus cost reduction due to research?
Certainly, as we're able to find existing data on that, we will include it in the study, because cost is one of the area that we're asked to look at in terms of how that might affect deployment in Oregon. And so, we'll be looking, as I mentioned, we're not going to be doing our own cost curves in-house. We will be looking at existing data for that. So to the extent that we can find that information and it seems reasonable, then certainly we will make inferences for Oregon based on that. But we won't be doing that actual analysis ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And Linda, I think I see a hand up.
Yes, Jamie, go ahead.
I didn't think my hand was up. I haven't been able to add any questions in here. Sorry about that. If you would like for the long duration energy storage, there is the long duration, the energy storage shot has a website that does have the cost and analysis on there, which does include hydrogen for some of these applications, and I can send you the link to that. So
I would
don't.
love it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very helpful. It's similar to what you see here, but it does have the costs in there. And on the airplanes, yeah, the airplane industry is looking at 2070 for hydrogen powered airplanes for the large ones. So like I said, I've been searching. I haven't been able to type in any questions, and I don't think I had my hand up, but maybe I did.
Well, thank you anyway, Jamie, for piping up. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't see any new questions, although every time I say that, a new one pops in. So we'll just give it a few minutes. Feel free to raise your hand. And Linda, remind folks on the phone, if they're on the phone, how they might be able to raise their hand. Is it *3?
Yes, *3 will raise your hand and I can unmute you at that time.
Great. So
Star-
anyone on the phone can hit *3 if they have a question or a comment. Thanks, Linda. Not seeing anything new come in. Just a reminder, we have some helpful links in the chat to the project page, Rebecca's contact information. The study is due next September 2022. Oh, and that's what happens. We got another question in. Greg Alderson says, how will this study avoid duplication of ODOT's mini study on hydrogen in transportation?
Thanks, Greg, and great question. So the ODOT study is really just, as you said, it's focused on transportation, and what they're really looking for is that study is making assumptions about, how much deployment of hydrogen we might see in the transportation industry in Oregon in both light duty and heavy duty, and then kind of extrapolating where we're expecting to see the need for hydrogen filling stations. And so it's really considered a technical add-on to their transportation electrification infrastructure needs assessment, or TINA study, that they recently published. And so it's a very specific look at kind of on the ground. Like, if we assume that we're going to have this many hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, where are they going to be? What kind are they going to be? Where are they going to need to fuel? And so I have no plans on duplicating that work, but will steal from it as needed to augment our study. So I've been in contact with ODOT, and so some of the work that they're doing will help inform the assumptions that we might make about, how the cost of deployment and for transportation and as an end use of renewable energy, what it might look like. And this is also, for example, why we have ODOT on our technical advisory committee, because they're going to be able to provide us some information on where there are opportunities to build on their work, as opposed to, just, not referencing it or redoing it, which obviously we can't do. Apologies if you can hear my beagle in the background.
Does Beagle have a comment or a question?
No, I just think it means we got to the end of that meaty bone that I I bribed him with.
Okay.
Well, if
And
there
that's
are no more questions, I really want to thank everyone for their time today. This study, we're really excited about it at Odo. And if you have, as I said, any questions, any follow-up comments, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then we'll also work with all of you in terms of trying to get those next workshops scheduled, especially the second one that that's going to be during session. Ruchi, I think I'm not sure that I saw the question that you're referring to.
Well, hey there, Rebecca. I think that I was looking at a question from my.
Hello?
I think Ruchi, you got remuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I think I was just looking back up at the chat and wasn't sure if Steve Ellis's question from earlier had been addressed about the technical advisory committee and the potential for having more business perspectives on it.
Was that I don't see the question, so is that exactly how it was phrased, or?
Yes. It was phrased as is there going to be anyone on the TAC that has actually been in the business of hydrogen production, supply, and deployment?
None of the organizations that are on the TAC right now are in that field. It's always possible that there might be an individual who at some point in their career may have worked in the private sector with hydrogen. I admit that we did not go through all of their CVs to look at what their past might have been, but we have made it clear that for the TAC, we are really asking them for unbiased technical information. And that's why we have more than one expert, with the hopes that, together we're hopefully going to get as much unbiased advice as we can on vetting data sources, on vetting assumptions, things like that.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Also appreciate all the activity in the chat, and like Rebecca mentioned, we'll be pulling that off so that we can make sure to address any other questions that we may not have gotten to on the workshop. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks again, everybody.
Just a reminder, the presentation that Rebecca walked through today is available on that webpage we shared, and we'll have a recording of this presentation available in the next couple of days.